Hi there, my name is Philip Ideson. I want to welcome you to the Art of Procurement podcast, the podcast that helps you, a forward-thinking procurement professional, position yourself and your team to proactively take advantage of the revolution that's taking place in procurement today. By interviewing industry trailblazers and sharing insights from our own experiences, my team and I pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that procurement teams are using to elevate their impact. And today on the show, I'm joined by a special guest, Tim Nelson, the CEO of charities Hope for Justice and Slave Free Alliance. Tim and I discuss the modern slavery and human trafficking that exists across supply chains today. We talk about some of the products and services that are high risk for modern slavery and the role that procurement professionals can and must play in protecting both human rights and your company's reputation. So let's go straight into the conversation. I started by asking Tim how he found himself in this line of work.
Yeah, so my background, after university, I went into banking. And one of my clients, when I was working for the bank, invited me to sit as an advisor to an offshore investment trust that they were setting up in the States. And I traveled across America and had a night spare in Los Angeles. And a friend of mine who worked for a children's charity out there brought a friend of his. And this friend introduced himself as a slave hunter. And I'd never heard of that phrase ever before. But his kind of challenge while we're on out for dinner, while he spoke to Condoleezza Rice, who was working for the Bush administration at the time, and he was arguing about the downgrading of India on the human trafficking register. He'd been in Mumbai the week before and seen girls in cages. And his challenge to me was, there may not be using cages all over the world, but maybe you should do something about this. And maybe if you don't do something about this, more people will be held against their will. So I came back to the UK. My wife can testify to the fact that I was up nights, not able to sleep. She was heavily pregnant with our first child, and we were building a house at the time, and it was all complex time, not the best of times to get involved in anything. But a friend of mine who had run a car dealership group had met with 4 individuals in Manchester with a view to potentially putting on an event. And he had said, look, you've got to include Tim in this. This is something that he's very much passionate about and would be able to help. So there were 10 of us that came together to found what became known as Hope for Justice. I got to name the charity. And 11 months later, we held our first event at Birmingham NEC, where we managed to get 5,884 people to come.
Wow, that's incredible for a first year of an event for a new charity. In fact, for a new anything.
Yeah, and it wasn't like it was close. You would know the distances and travel times, but a good 2.5 to 3 hours from where we live. So it's not like I could just pull on friends that live close. It's very much trying to go out and tell people about what we're trying to do and what we wanted to do, and raising awareness and raising the profile of this as an issue, and mobilizing a group of people to come behind to really see a shift in this issue.
So I want to talk a little bit about definitions just to start with. First of all, if you could just talk about modern slavery and kind of how you define modern slavery.
Yeah, it's quite a controversial term from a US perspective, because that term slavery conjures up images of the transatlantic slave trade and everything that William Wilberforce fought for. I think what we have seen is that slavery in its sense was banned, but it adapted and over time has become what we call modern day slavery. And there is a definition around trafficking, a definition around modern day slavery, which is around the act, the means, and the purpose of what people are doing and using an individual for. But in its basic terms, because I want to make it as easy for people to understand, is where you have someone who is forced against their will to do something whereby it could earn money for someone else. So that could be any one of say 4 core areas, where we have labor trafficking, people trafficked to work in businesses, in agricultural settings, in factories, in making goods and services. You have those people who are held in domestic servitude, where they're forced to stay in homes and clean homes, and quite often beaten and raped and tortured at the same time. And then alongside that, those people who are held in sexual exploitation. There is a fourth one where individuals are trafficked for their organs, and that's known as organ harvesting as well. But it only occurs in countries where primarily there's no organ donation scheme. So any of the times it occurs either in the US or the UK or other more kind of westernized nations, it's generally where that organ harvesting has happened in a third-party country before traveling across.
So what, from a Hope for Justice perspective, could you just shine a little bit of a light on, what are some of the things that you're doing in terms of awareness and, kind of I guess driving awareness, but also driving impact to reduce modern slavery?
Yeah, so we try to address it with 4 core areas, and we call them prevention, rescue, restore, and reform. And wanting to live in a world free from slavery by attacking each one of those in any of the countries that we're operational in. Hope for Justice has grown from when we started back in 2008 to now, where we're operational in 7 countries. We have just over 400 staff. We are determined to try and make a bigger impact. For each one of the countries and each one of those 4 areas, we have to adapt what we do based on the localized settings. So in places like Ethiopia, where we've been working to try and help individuals who find themselves in exploitation, primarily children, we're looking at how we can try and find those children, working with the government to bring them to one of our what we call lighthouses, which are short-term transition centers. We started those in Cambodia and brought them across to Ethiopia and Uganda. And then we trace out where families haven't been complicit in any form of exploitation. And we look to give them catch-up education, provide them with medical care, and then place them back into their families and have a stable, ongoing relationship for up to 2 years afterwards to make sure that they're settled into those areas. We came up with the term lighthouse because we thought it did what it said on the tin. We hadn't anticipated that by launching it into Ethiopia, which is a landlocked country, that many people wouldn't necessarily understand the concept. But you learn as you go. And for what we've tried to do, we've tried to bring an approach where we can pinpoint where the needs are the most. So in places like the States, we had set up a rescue center in the UK, and we modeled what we brought to the UK into the US. And we currently now have 3 operational, what we call rescue hubs, one that's based out of Tennessee, one that's based out of Iowa, and one that's based out of North Carolina. And they operate within the states that they are and the adjoining states, and they work well. They work a lot with other NGOs in that space, a lot of local government services, but we take on former senior police officers to do undercover intelligence gathering, former FBI, CIA, to find victims and then be able to see them rescued. But along that journey, we've also then looked to what we need to do to address the underlying problem that we find. So one of the issues around labor trafficking is it's so widespread. Individuals, whether they're from the country that we find them in or they've been brought or come as immigrants, fundamentally those individuals need to be helped. And we had one case in the UK where one of those rescue centres in an area in the West Midlands, just one case led to over 400 victims being identified from a Polish gang under an operation called Operation Fort. We were asked by a lot of the businesses that were involved in the supply chains for the companies where these individuals had been placed. We effectively found out that we could do something to try and help them rather than just, hey, we can help or we can provide you training. And we worked with Accenture to set up a division of Hope for Justice, which we call Slave Free Alliance. And Slave Free Alliance now, as of we are today, has 111 major multinational companies on board. And we work to try and help them with all aspects of understanding where vulnerabilities are within their supply chains. And then beyond that, as we step further into trying helping to set strategy for them so that they can become a fortress, so that all issues of modern day slavery, human trafficking can't exist.
I'd love to actually talk about that in a little while when we talk about kind of what as procurement supply chain professionals can we actually do. Is modern slavery an issue that is increasing in, its occurrence, or is it more that organizations like Hope for Justice are shining a brighter light on it, so it's becoming more known? How do you kind of look at that?
The estimates at the moment for issues of modern day slavery is that they estimate there are now more people than has ever been in some form of modern day slavery. The last estimates that the ILO, the International Labour Organization, estimates are that there are over 49.6 million people held in some form of modern day slavery. To put it in context, that is more than at any point in time in human history, and significantly more than were trafficked as part of the transatlantic slave trade, if you added up all of it within its totality. Part of organizations shining a light on it helps people to become aware so that they can spot the signs and they can find them. But the reality is for us at the moment that the risks to traffickers are so low and the incentives are so high that it gives fuel for individuals and serious and organized crime to look to exploit individuals on an industrial scale. And in many cases, many countries are only now becoming aware to the scale of the actual problem that exists within their own country, rather than just, again, what may happen overseas.
Yeah, I'm sure it's really easy to say, oh, well, that's a problem in, country A or country B. That doesn't happen here in the UK, or that doesn't happen here in the US, when the reality is very different.
Absolutely. And I think it's not until people understand that what makes a company a good or bad company is not whether or not they have modern day slavery, because the reality is for most companies, they will have some amount of modern day slavery within their supply chains. It's whether they're prepared to look and what will they do when they find it. I think that's what makes people a good or bad company, because if they're prepared to look and they're prepared to do something about it, then those are the companies to be celebrated. I think we've realized how ingrained and endemic slavery has become across the board. We've realized how there is a sense that individuals may want to address this, but without having a thought through professional approach, the areas and the opportunities for exploitation are just so vast.
Are there best practices in how to start looking? Where would you start?
Yeah, so the first thing I would encourage anyone who's thinking about it is have a conversation with us, because we'd love to help you and your particular business that you're involved in. Whether we're working in your sector or working in your country, we'd love to be able to give you a kind of overview of where you need to start. What we tend to do when we go into a company is we do what we call gap analysis, which is where we try to pinpoint where the greatest red flags are.
Yeah.
And that might be that we can talk about the location or the type of product or the type of service that you're working with. I can give you a few examples of that.
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah.
So if, say, for instance, you're working in the construction industry, it's an area where actually modern day slavery is rife. Whether that's individuals working on building sites who are subcontractors or subcontractors of subcontractors, or whether you're going into the actual products or services that are being used. Recently, I was looking at key components that are used across building sites. And for a lot of construction in the US, you would use drywall, or plasterboard is another way of saying it in the UK. But a key component of drywall is mica. And mica is a stone that is mined primarily in two regions, in India and in Madagascar. Mica is actually also found in electrical cabling for insulation. So anytime that you have large potential circuits that are liable to catch fire or to overheat, they use mica to insulate those cables, so to reduce the risk of fire in big buildings. So this is it's not something you see, it's something that's ingrained, it's a product within it. But the majority of mica mining is now being done by 5-year-old children, 5 to 10-year-old children in those areas. And I think for most people who are thinking of construction, it's not the first thing that you're thinking of. But actually, by asking the right questions, we can start to drive behavior differently. So it is possible, because the two regions of India Currently, you're not allowed to mine mica in those regions, but those companies are sourcing that mica from that area. So by asking the right questions, by drilling into those companies, taking the right approach, you can pinpoint a particular product or service that might be an issue for them. It could be, I've talked about construction, but it could be something around simple product or service, something like palm oil. And for those of you who don't know, palm oil is used in so many places across the board, whether it's your potato chip wrapper or your can or whatever good that you might find. It quite often it's coated in a palm oil. They use it a lot in cosmetics or in shampoos and things like that. It allows for the product not to stick and bond to the actual surface of the container that it's in. But palm oil production is primarily found in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in Thailand, in Nigeria, and it's all being made through exploitative working. It's very rare that you would find palm oil that isn't. But for most people, they would be shocked that actually a product that they picked up on a regular basis, they were finding there were real issues with it.
And so as I think from a procurement supply chain perspective, a lot of the examples will be it's not first tier supplier. So, for construction, it's not, if you're an organization, you outsource the building of a building to somebody, it's actually tier two, or tier two, being it's then who they employ, or tier two, that's the equipment they buy. You're not necessarily buying that directly, but you're buying it indirectly. So I think if there's common products and services that are more exposed to the risks of exploitation, that those allow you to then start asking questions of your providers about what they know about their sub providers as well.
Yeah, I mean, you start from that perspective of asking the question. It's a instead of a tick box, it's asking the question of what have your suppliers or that company that you're the quantity surveyor who's involved in building the building project that you're on, giving them the license to ask the right questions can make massive difference around the impact that people would understand what is going on in their business, in their supply chain. I think sometimes for a lot of supply chain experts, they can feel a bit overwhelmed by this because we've talked about price and we've talked about quality. We've talked about, things being done on a just-in-time basis. So it all seems to line up, and it can be very difficult for people to feel, oh, you're asking me to be responsible for my entire supply chain. Yeah. And that's where I think from where the world that we have been to where we are now, that's where we've seen the biggest shift. Legislation like that in Germany, as of the 1st of January this year, now they ask for every company that even has a subsidiary in Germany to be able to justify all of their supply chain. Mm-hmm. Now, quite often that involves using technology, that involves, a considerable amount more work and effort than has been done around supply chains. But what it is starting to lead to is some really involved questions, and it's leading to some advice and support for companies in other far-flung parts of the world where they're starting to make better choices, and where they're trying to remove it from their supply chains. And I think the new legislation that's coming through around shipping vessels for supply is something that most people won't be aware of. But this year, the rules and regulation on the age of vehicles will denote what speed those shipping vessels can go at. And if they're an older vessel, they're going to have to travel at 10% less time than they have, 10% less speed, which will create a lot more time for products to get to the right place. Yeah. So at that moment, it may lead supply chain experts to asking questions of, well, is there somewhere more locally? Is there some other location we can get? At that moment in time, it could even be that moment that's a spark of maybe we need to ask different questions when we're thinking about moving supply. Or if we get what happened before, where costs spiral from a supply chain perspective, and people are looking to kind of bring it much, much closer to where their production is needed, those are perfect opportunities for us to ask much more questions.
Do you find, maybe palm oil is an example, maybe there's another example where there is a lot of exploitation in that supply chain. Do you find that there are alternative sources which aren't using exploited supply chain, or is it sometimes there's something that you buy that is just that's the only option? So then it's more of an education and trying to use your leverage to clean up that supply chain as opposed to going and moving to another provider.
Yeah, there can be sometimes there can be products where you've got single source, or you've got you've got real questions over the validity of whether there is some form of exploitation. An example would probably be cobalt production. For those who aren't aware, cobalt is used in your mobile phone. It's used in your electric car battery. Cobalt itself, for the UK and Europe to move to the electrification of vehicles, the Paris Accord said it will need 30 times more cobalt and rare earth minerals mined to enable that to happen. But the reality is that majority of cobalt that's being mined is being mined by exploitative workers, and it's being mined in places like the Congo, in Zambia. I heard recent reports of Venezuela where cobalt is being mined by real exploitation. Now, for car manufacturers, there's some initiatives that are coming through at the moment. I know the European Union is working on almost like a battery passport that they're creating as a mechanism to be able to counteract more of the understanding of where products are coming from. But like we've seen with copper, there was an initiative called Green Copper, where you're able to verify where the products are coming from. And it's those initiatives that give us hope that there are other options coming forward. I think there can be a lot of skepticism around this or any other aspect of ESG. There can be quite a bit of pushback because people can say, Tim, you're trying to mandate us to fix the world's problems. I want to make my widget and sell my widget, and I want to do well at what I'm doing. But there is a sense now that we're seeing across the world that governments are passing the responsibility that has sat with governments now onto businesses, because governments have felt entirely inadequate to the task of being able to do this because they're so far removed from the business's everyday decision making. And with the German legislation, it carries up to a 2% per occurrence fine for any company that's seen to be complicit or compliant with modern slavery within their supply chain. If you start calculating what that looks like for a group, if you start seeing fines coming through, then it's risk. And for most companies, they want to manage and mitigate the risks that they have on their risk register. And we would hope that this is something that's starting to ratchet its way up the risk register as something that people need to change, not just for the ethical reasons, but also because consumers and investors are now starting to really change their mentality around what they want and what they're prepared to tolerate.
Do you feel that? So it's interesting you talk about governments recognizing that perhaps they don't have all the tools at their disposal to solve for this, and they're pushing some of that into business. Is this something that when you think what are some of the ideal ways that we can all work collectively to overcome modern slavery? Is it government? Does it start with government and regulatory requirements? Because I see more and more regulatory requirements kind of starting to come out, or is that just the trigger for businesses to really think about? And it's everything for businesses. We all hope that businesses act in what is the right thing to do, and the reality is oftentimes, and most times, it's because that's driven by other factors, as you said, like access to funds or reputational risk. Do you see that that's more of a driver of business involvement, or whether it's coming from the regulatory side?
Interesting. I think quite often the biggest driver can be around investors. Ultimately, if an investor pulls their funding, it massively affects the share price, which massively affects whether the chief exec stays in the role that they're in. So I would say investors above all have the real clout and ability. Legislation has its place, and in some places, legislation is driving an agenda of change. It's very clear that the European Union is moving in a very quick order to a place where companies will hold all of the responsibility for within their supply chain. But in terms of what the triggers are, you get really good companies that want to be best in class. and they're the ones who will very much try and be the first to do something to adopt the changes that need to. Quite often the companies that we're working with at Slave Free Alliance are those companies that have said, help us now, because we know that if you help us now, it's going to save a lot of money down the line. It'll also help us in what we're doing. The way that business is set up to make money. Quite often what also drives this and what drives this happening is short-termist views from companies around profit. So if there's a sense of a company setting an agenda of change for between 3 to 5 years, where they're just trying to exploit as much money out of a situation, they'll make decisions based on the next 3 years, rather than saying, hey, this is something that's endemic within our company. Let's spend the next decade working our way towards making a better resolve. And quite often you can see the difference of a mature business versus a business that maybe has popped up the last couple of years. But we see that modern day slavery will thrive in businesses where they're not as well developed by having the right people and processes and policies in place to protect themselves. So a lot of the startup businesses, a lot of the early adopting company phase, that tends to be the phase where you've got a considerable amount of risk, because you quite often people will go to things like the Shenzhen Fair in China, where you can walk around it and it would take you 7 days to walk around it, and you can go and see every booth for whatever, maybe 5 million companies that are demonstrating what there are. And you might think, I'll go and buy 20,000 ornaments for Christmas trees or something crazy like that. That can be as far as anyone ever gets to getting to the factory or the factories that are involved in making the process.
You don't even think about where it came from.
Not at all. And therefore it arrives in boxes sent on a shipment coming from the place where it's made. And what we're asking for is that companies would be a bit more mindful of the particular products that they're bringing on board, and actually starting a process of change. We don't advocate boiling the ocean. We know that companies got limited budgets to try and spend on these areas, and that's where Hope for Justice and Slave Free Alliance want to be a trusted friend to businesses. Why we want to have conversations with people who are making difficult decisions and trying to do the best that they can with the time and the finances that they have. So I can see it change though, and I can see that companies are there has been definitely in the last year, there's been a shift for us in terms of how much, since the pandemic, how much spotlight has been brought to this area. I think the fines from German perspective, also in Australia, in New South Wales, there's an $800,000 fine being brought in there. They're game changers, because when we go back to in 2000, when the Transparency and Supply Chain Act came through from Governor Schwarzenegger in California, where they mandated putting certain requests on online, where you're a company over 100 million turnover, you started to demonstrate what you're doing. It's a long way from that just showing something on your website to where we're now saying, you're going to be held responsible financially. There is a phase that we think it will go to where CEOs may become criminally liable for decision making that they're making, where they're complicit within exploitation. But that's the trajectory that we're on in terms of where we want to see justice being brought at every level. We don't want to see companies exposed. We want to see companies make better decisions.
Yeah, I feel that you talked that there's some companies that are working with you to really address this through their supply chain. Kind of, they set the standard for the industry that they work in, and so then you want for it to become a competitive disadvantage for everybody else in that industry to not be doing the same. And they you get the innovators, or the ones that are really taking this seriously, that then kind of pull everybody up in that industry, because if you're not doing it at that point, then it impacts your ability to sell what it is that you're selling. From a procurement perspective, it sounds like it's about asking questions, first and foremost, asking questions in your RFPs, asking questions in any governance that you have, starting to make that part of your decision tree, even if it's just, do you know, versus, do you not know? Because that was, we in procurement have we have an awful lot of power and leverage to drive change in things like this, because if we start asking for it, then people who want business have got no choice but to start responding to it.
Yeah, I definitely, certainly whenever you get into an RFP stage, I think if you can ask those kind of questions, the first stage I would like to see though is where procurement experts are trained and they know what they're dealing with.
Yeah.
And that's where it goes from anecdotal information to a real awareness that's leading to action. And I think if the individuals themselves who are listening to this or their businesses understand the issue, understand where their vulnerabilities are, then suddenly it's a much, much greater conversation. And quite often in that conversation with suppliers, we would advocate for bringing them along in the journey and being open and transparent with them, because the people in your supply chain can be very worried that you're going to be dropping them or trying to bypass them, trying to get something cheaper, trying to understand more of your business model if you're a supplier. Whereas if you're open and saying, look, this is something we actually want to address, we're trying to deal with this, we're trying to get hold of it, can you come with us on the journey? We've done for multinational companies, we've provided gap analysis for their biggest supplier. And that's been done by collaboration and partnership and understanding, but it helps them pinpoint for their largest supplier where their biggest weakness is. Yeah. And the supplier is very happy because it helps them to be more transparent without providing that additional information. Another way that we've worked is we try to pull together industry, because we find that once you get a number of them coming together where they say they're not going to compete on human rights, then it transcends. It also, there's the collective bargaining power. You might be 2% of somebody's business if you're getting supply from them. But if you're working with a lot of other businesses, suddenly you might be 30 or 40%.
Everyone's asking the same questions in the industry.
Yeah. So we set up in the UK a number of groups, and we're looking to set those up in other jurisdictions as well. But we've got one that's utilities against slavery. And we have 22 of the biggest utilities companies that are involved in it. Now, what the suppliers to those utilities companies love is suddenly they're not being hit by 22 questionnaires that come from the various companies, but they're working with effectively one standard that everyone can adhere to. And where there are issues, then the industry can deal with it. But they're not worried that, if we make that choice to move away from pick ABC country where this is happening to another country, that if it's going to cost us a little bit extra, suddenly the other companies are still staying with ABC and they're going to make a competitive advantage. But by everybody collectively not acting as an oligopoly against trade, but by looking at it and saying, no, the floor level is human rights. We shouldn't compete on human rights, and then everything else we can compete on. But ultimately, we want to try and make sure that our industry is not exposed to this, because when one person in an industry is exposed, that tide can lower the marker for everybody.
Yeah. I imagine, because one of the things I wrote down there is, is it denialism or is it fear or is it lack of understanding sometimes when it's not addressed? And, as you think bringing together industry players collectively, if examples of modern slavery are uncovered, then that's not necessarily pointing a finger at one company. It's saying, okay, as an industry, we've got a challenge that we need to overcome. And I think from a reputational perspective, that's probably one of the things that leads to the denialism, or I don't want to open Pandora's boxes, I'm afraid of what I might find.
Yeah, I think the challenge I would bring to anybody about inaction is it's got a really terrible way of being able to catch up with you. There's one retailer in the UK that had an article that went in a major newspaper on a Sunday, and by Tuesday that company had lost £2 billion off their share price, and they haven't regained the share price position that they had previously, because a lot of the investing companies have ESG boards who are looking at the potential risks to their business. If you wait until the newspaper article hits, it's going to be too late. Yeah. You're not going to be able to play catch up. So, it's incumbent upon every company to start on the journey. And in countries like the UK, where you have to do a modern slavery statement, you have to say what you're doing every year as part of your financial accounts if you bring in more than 36 million annual revenue.
Has ESG and the push to ESG made your job easier, so to say, in demonstrating the importance and the creating the platform for companies to be serious about addressing modern slavery?
It's possibly created a framework for people to understand it. I think there are other areas within ESG that have been lifted higher and given more airtime or more preeminence. I think the discussion around the climate emergency is definitely one. We see other areas of ESG, the access to water rights, and the impact that business can have across the world is becoming much more aware. It's certainly moved in a lot of major multinational companies that ESG is now a C-suite level job. Yeah. So before it would have been someone working for the procurement director. Now it's someone of the level of the procurement director that's looking at this issue, because it carries just so many threats, and it almost doesn't sit neatly within any other jurisdiction, because could it sit in finance? Maybe because there's a regulatory point of view. We're seeing now banks and insurance companies offering discounted lending, discounted insurance policies by open and transparent supply chain. So there's a benefit to it.
Yeah.
And then you see people with procurement going, like, this is our issue, but it's not exclusively our issue. It sits across so many other.
We can't fix it on our own.
No, and then you get maybe the company secretary, or you get the CEO, who then has to answer to investors, has to answer to the city and other kind of stakeholders within the business that then is interested in this. So I think as we have seen society move, it's incumbent upon. There's a phrase that there was a Greek proverb that once said that society thrives when old men plant trees that they know that they're not going to sit under the shade of those trees. And I think it's important for business leaders to start a process that they may not see the fulfillment of where the company could get to in terms of protecting that company, but actually it's going to, even within the tenure that they've got, you'll see some very good green shoots coming up. You'll see the company itself start to change as a direct result, but they may never get to that end point.
Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast to talk about, obviously it's an incredibly important topic, and one that procurement and supply chain professionals are really slap bang in the middle of being able to do something about it. So I hope we've inspired some listeners to take some early steps and to take some actions. And if they are inspired, they want to learn more about Hope for Justice, they want to know more about Slave Free Alliance, where would be the best place for them to find you?
Please go to our websites, hopeforjustice.org or slavefreealliance.org. Feel free to if you want to message me directly, go on LinkedIn, get hold of us. I think we've never been in a world where you can't get hold of people. If you want to, you can always find them. But Hope for Justice, search me, Tim Nelson, on LinkedIn and shoot me an email, and I'm very happy to connect anyone with the relevant people. And even if it's just for, hey, we've got this issue, could you help? Can you point us in the right direction? Because we're an NGO, we want to try and make sure that we can live in a world free from slavery, and we know that if we offer the benefit of help, it will move people along. So I really, really have enjoyed this conversation, and thank you so much for the privilege.
Well, I'll include links, all the links that you mentioned, to Hope for Justice, to Slave Free Alliance, to your LinkedIn profile on our show notes for today's episode. Those will be with all of our podcasts at artofprocurement.com/podcast. That's artofprocurement.com/podcast. And Tim, one last time, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
If this episode struck a chord with you, please do send it to somebody. We grow here at Art of Procurement through word of mouth, and that would be really appreciated. You can also support us by giving us a thumbs up, a star rating, or a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Since 2015, we've built the world's largest free resource for procurement professionals looking to elevate their impact. Our resources span podcasts like this, videos, blog posts, papers, and events. To join us on the inside and to ensure you never miss an episode, a webinar, event, or a post, please do subscribe to our weekly newsletter, This Week in Procurement. You can do that at artofprocurement.com/subscribe. That's artofprocurement.com/subscribe. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.